Hello. Before we start our talk, we would like to acknowledge that this presentation is being recorded on Aboriginal land and to pay our respects to the elders of the Awabakal and Worimi Nation, past and present, and also extend this respect to any Indigenous people present at the conference. Today, we're going to talk about the PARADISEC podcast, Toksave Culture Talks, and which is co-produced by myself and Stephen Gagau, and look at how this reconnects communities with archival collections through the production of the podcast. The concept of the podcast is that we talk with people who have cultural and personal connections to PARADISEC archives, and in so doing, allow them to give their perspectives and to have a voice. And this gives us greater knowledge and metadata surrounding these collections. We use Stephen's networks as part of the One Top community, that is the Melanesian diaspora community in Sydney and beyond, and also my own connections through working with Indigenous Australian people. Our first series was launched in 2019 as part of the United Nations Year of Indigenous Languages, and we covered the areas of the Trobriand Islands and Rabaul in Papua New Guinea. We interviewed Linda Anderson, a Pintubi Luritja woman who's in the Alice Springs region, and also Palmer Island in Vanuatu. This year, we're launching the 2020 episodes this afternoon, and we have covered out to Fiji with the Fiji Hindi community, back to Palmer with a revisit from Johnny Obed. We also went to the Rego district of Papua New Guinea and interviewed the Rakmakmak Murunungu mother and daughter duo Pai and Emily Ford. And now I hand over to Stephen.
Firstly, I'll draw your attention to the quote on the screen, and that's by Besarab and Ngandu. And that talks about storytelling in Indigenous communities and oral traditions. Allowing Indigenous voices to be valued is what Toksave podcast recognizes, and engaging speaker communities with our archival collections, where participants have that personal and cultural connection. Indigenous people are cultural knowledge owners and bearers, and therefore their Indigenous voices must be shared through their lived experiences to reflect, connect, and reconnect to their past through the legacy recordings in the archive. Our production of Toksave podcast prioritizes Indigenous voices through their oral traditions, as I mentioned, and that makes meaning from research that values the voices, at the same time to be in the perspective of a culturally appropriate methodology that we need to embrace. Now we will have a listen to Rakrak Maranungu women as a mother and daughter, or combination Pai and Emily.
The transferring of knowledge through the generation, and it's very reassuring to know that that knowledge is going to continue. It might not be the same practices from the past, but it's still our knowledge, and it's still being continued, and that's what's important.
And a lot of the people's voices on there, I'd heard stories about all of my life, and there were people like who Mum knew, who she'd tell me stories about. Dad would tell me stories about different family members. They'd always come up in, family stories, sitting around having a yarn. And it was really very moving to sit with all the old people and to sit with Mum and me as one of the later generations, and being able to hear all the knowledge that they had, and through the archive, and having that sort of using technology to be able to do that.
It's like unlocking the archives to allow a more personal approach to accessing that information and knowledge in a new way.
Next, we listen to Linda Anderson, a Pintupi Luritja woman, talking about her knowledge in cultural traditions.
Nowadays, we listen to radio, and we wake up to radio being in a plate in the morning. We used to listen to them singing. No radio, but beautiful singing from elders, It's like going on a journey, and the song would take to places after places, and every little song had a message to the children. Let's put it this way. It's just like a storybook. When you're flipping over pages, you would read one page about that particular picture. So it's like that.
The podcast production enables connection and reconnection for people from speaker communities. First, we will hear from Prash Krishnan, who first came to the PARADISEC as an intern, and he discovered Jeff Siegel's collection of Fiji Hindi materials, and you can hear how he saw this as a way of reconnecting with his cultural heritage.
As an Indo-Fijian born in Australia, I've always felt a disconnect with my Kmittia heritage. Over the past few years, I've been on this journey to try and reconnect. My first real breakthrough was discovering the JS2 collection, and then getting the opportunity to talk to Jeff has really helped me better understand my feelings towards the Fiji Hindi language and my connection with the Kmittias.
And now we'll hear from Eileen Bobone, and she talks about listening to archival recordings and how that felt and how it brought back memories and a reconnection to her own past and her father.
Okay, my first reaction was, I kind of felt sad. The reaction was I wanted to cry, because then I know that listening to this is the only connection to my father, because he was so into cultural things. So then my first instance was I wanted to cry. And then the next instance is being almost like every other place around me just goes into nothingness, and I'm just sitting inside in this village, open space, and there's only ground. And I'm sitting there and I'm listening to this because I've got some men sitting there and they're actually singing that song to me.
The next slide is about collaboration. That's bridging archives and communities. As you can see there, there's two diagrams. This is part of our PARADISEC team's co-authoring of an article that we was published, and it talks about this diagram with the traditional way, meaning connecting the researcher or the collector goes into speaker communities, obtaining materials, depositing them in the archive, then produces publications for conferences and lectures. We would like to propose, and we are practicing the archival loop, which is on the next diagram, and that is to bridge the archive back into the speaker communities through a digital media access. And one of them is through podcast that we are doing through Toksave. And I will let Jodie discuss the processes that we go through.
Thank you, Stephen. So I guess the podcast could be seen as an example of how the archival loop works. So previously, the collector, as Stephen said, would place the objects in the archive where they would remain fairly static. And what we do now with the podcast, so the collector has worked with the speaker community and placed the objects in the archive, but then you have this kind of loop going back. First is the fact that the archive is online, so people in the community can access it. But we also, as part of the podcast production, we give a hard drive with the relevant materials to the interviewee, who are then free to take that back to their communities and share it with other people. In creating the podcast, it's actually a collaboration, because one of the first things we do is we ask them to go through the collection, and Stephen liaises with community members. So they get to know the data and can feed knowledge back into the archive that then goes into the online catalogue. The collaboration as we get through to the interview really allows for a voice for the people from the speaker community. And a lot of times we could actually put an arrow in here because the collector can be involved in as well. When we have these publications coming out and presentations like we're giving today, we also are able to use the voices and include the voices from the speaker community. So the whole kind of loop is a much more complex workflow that allows a differing, the voices of Indigenous people to be heard.
The importance of establishing and building relationship is more about ensuring cultural safety, accountability, and values. So it's more of a long-term relationship rather than a short-term rapport established in an interview, for instance. So the longer-term relationship will be more like an insider-outsider relationship, and that is a cultural knowledge bearer with a researcher or an outsider who comes in to study that culture. It consolidates that partnership and a collaborative approach to disseminating and sharing Indigenous knowledge. So valuing Indigenous voices, we are the experts of our own cultural knowledge. Two examples we have here is Michael Webb and myself. I am a PNG Tolai person and sitting with University of Sydney researcher Michael Webb. We have developed this relationship from the archive, his archival collection, through the podcast, and now we've actually ventured into a further project, a ethnomusicological project that is about my people, my culture, about music of my people. And the next relationship that you see there is between Johnny Obed and Kirk, who've known each other for about 30 years since they've been in Vanuatu, and they happen to live in Sydney together. We've been able to collaborate and put them together so that they produce one of the podcasts that you will hear this afternoon. And that is that relationship that we talk about, where it's not just an activity, but it's that relationship.
And finally, I am going to call upon Grace Hull and Johnny Obed to talk about bringing the archive alive through their personal and cultural connections, their emotional rediscovery of the past, and the value of storytelling. First, we'll hear from Grace, and in this example, she is going to explain the meaning of one of the songs in the RL1 collection that previously we didn't have this knowledge about.
That is the cry of a mother just lost a child or a baby, and saying, I have, as the waves crashes, the white foam I see. I can't help myself, but I have to pick up the flowers and put it in my arms and sway with the waves. I want to come and flow with you.
And now I'm going to leave the last word to Johnny Obed, because he can describe the importance of storytelling way better than I can.
For me, I'm looking to weave a basket that would hold water for our understanding, because we look forward to hearing somebody telling stories. They call them metesao, a storyteller as a wise man. And when he stands up to tell his story, it brings that excitement, the motivation, and everybody's looking for what is he going to say next. You hold on to every word that is being spoken.
This presentation is reference to an article that Jodie and I wrote and published in the UMAC journal, as can be seen on the screen. You can find the podcast on our PARADISEC website at the Toksave podcast page, as well as the Sydney Conservatorium of Music research page. And I thank you all for listening.